If we talk about a rising superpower in the world, we will have to talk about China. While some nations ensure their influence with brutal military force, some try to gain authority in a geopolitical regime through economic influence. In the modern world, the most efficient way of gaining authority in a geopolitical context is controlling the economy of a country. And to do so, most developed and powerful nations use the technique called debt trap. By the end of the 1980s, Chinese economists saw some potential opportunities to gain authority in global geopolitics. And the opportunity is to gain a superior economic position using its vast population and land. After understanding the idea, the Chinese economy has grown vastly over the years and made itself the most important exporter in any part of the world. Currently, China is the controller of around 15% of the global export market alone. While there are more than 200 countries in the world, China alone is responsible for more than 15% of global exports. After gaining an important position in the economy of almost every country in the world, the Chinese government has focused on global geopolitics. When the economy stored a good position and made countries dependent on them for the export of necessary goods, the Chinese government started to find out opportunities in investing in the nations that are important for China geographically. One of these countries is Sri Lanka. Many economists argue about the fact that the country has established its debt trap diplomacy in different regions of Asia and Africa, and most notably of all Sri Lanka. The approach for implementing a debt trap is very clear. Initially, they find out potential investment opportunities in a country where democracy is shattered and an authoritarian government is established. In such economies, the government is not much liable to the people, and people do not have much authority over the decisions made by the government. Corruption level is also very high in such economies. The concept of debt trap comes here. The developed country with vast wealth to invest approach just the authoritarian country to invest in its economy. The investment is based on a loan with a high level of interest, and in almost 100% of the cases, the corrupt governments of low-income and undeveloped countries fail to pay the loans back. In this way, powerful nations like China establish control over the economy of low-income poor nations. This is what exactly happened to Sri Lanka in simple words. But the debt trap is not as simple as it looks in words. The investments made by the powerful nation are also very lucrative, which reflects a great deal of economic growth and creates a bubble of economic fantasy that is not visible at all in the first glance. Most of these high-interest loan agreements are made to develop projects like highway construction, pool construction, ports, airports, and railway constructions. These types of projects are visible to the world and make people believe easily in potential economic growth. These types of projects are mainly helpful for the lower-class society of the country, which does not have many ideas about return on investments. Also, these projects do not have a much higher level of return on investment, which makes it more complicated for the loan taker to pay back the loans. Not only Sri Lanka, other South Asian countries like Bangladesh and Pakistan have also taken a large sum of loans with a high level of interest from China. And the most terrible thing that happened to the globe in recent times is the COVID-19 pandemic, which is also having a major impact on the economies of loan-taking poor countries. As the pandemic had devastating effects on the economies of every country in the world, many countries with a large amount of debt are on the verge of getting bankrupt in no time. This is what exactly happened to the economy of Sri Lanka. The country took a large sum of loans from the Chinese government, and when the COVID-19 had hit the economy of Sri Lanka during the COVID-19, they couldn't deal with the situation and went bankrupt. Now the question is, what are the key benefits to China from the bankrupted nations? 1. Authority over the economy. 2. Control over the geopolitical structure of the country. As China becomes the largest bilateral debtor of these countries, it can easily have control over the economic and geopolitical decisions of these countries. To gain control over the countries that are geopolitically very important to China, the country has been playing the role of both the IMF and the World Bank. China specifically targets the countries which lack the below-mentioned factors. 1. A proper macroeconomic framework. 2. A stable government. 3. The discipline of fiscal structure. 4. Steps against corruption. 5. Maintenance of human rights. The trade friendship between the then Sri Lankan government and China started in 2005 when the nation was struggling with its internal civil clash and internal political systems. China directly helped the government to establish many projects in its southern voter base at Hambantota, which consists of almost 3% of the national population of Sri Lanka. One of these projects is the Hambantota Airport, which is one of the most underused port facilities in the world. Also, there is an international conference center at this airport, which has hosted only one conference after its establishment period. This is a prime example of debt-based establishments with low returns, which leaves the borrower with no opportunities to pay the money back to the lender. You will be shocked to hear about the current situation at Hambantota Airport. After years of failing to pay the borrowed money back, Sri Lanka has lost control over the airport. And now the Hambantota Airport is ruled and authorized by China. In 2017, the Sri Lankan authorities handed the authority of the port to China, and the Sri Lankan Port Authority will gain it back after 35 years. So, simply, the Chinese will have control over this strategic location for 35 years, which give them a large geopolitical advantage in the upcoming years. Another Chinese-funded project that is a big failure is the Lotus Tower established in Colombo, which is the tallest self-supported structure in South Asia. This tower is also yet to be opened to the general people of Sri Lanka. Even though all the above-mentioned projects were absolute failures and became liabilities for the Sri Lankan economy, China financed largely a project called Colombo Port City. The main plan of this project was to establish Colombo as a port city that will be rival to the Singapore ports, which is one of the most economically powerful ports in the world. The project is under construction, and the economists believe that this port will also end up like the Hambantota Airport. The main reasons why Sri Lanka collapsed so devastatingly are analyzed shortly in the final part of this case study. Corrupted economic structure. Sri Lanka is one of the first South Asian nations to develop economic reformation projects in the late 1970s. The country took initiatives to reform its economy around 40 to 50 years ago. But the corrupted economic structure and bureaucratic attitude of the government employees led to economic devastation since the start of the economic reforms. After 1980, Sri Lanka had to seek around 16 IMF bailouts as the country couldn't deal with the taken loans properly. Corrupted government officials and politicians didn't allow the economy to grow to its full potential. Also, civil wars and unstable political situations inspired corrupted officials to take the opportunity of every unstable situation over the last 40 years. The country could never maintain a structured fiscal and monetary structure, which led to the destruction of the economic structure day after day. Finally, in 2020, the country faced a forex crisis, and it boosted the collapse of the economy. One of the major sectors that brought Sri Lanka a large amount of foreign currency was its tourism sector. But in the COVID-19 crisis, the tourism industry of the country was disrupted and the revenue flow stopped. In this situation, the country had to continue the necessary imports, and the export situation was also terrible. In this way, the country ran out of foreign reserves, and the corrupted economic structure of the country didn't leave much reserve to deal with the situation. This is how the Sri Lankan economy collapsed. Impacts of global economic crisis. As we talked about earlier, the crisis led by the global pandemic COVID-19 had major impacts on the economy of Sri Lanka. But the situation was not only bad in Sri Lanka. Different countries around the world had to face and currently are facing the negative impacts of COVID-19 on their economy. Most low-income countries like Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and Bangladesh heavily depend on the foreign remittance sent by the native people who work in different parts of the world. Foreign remittance is the key factor that is continuously pushing the economy of this country to stay alive in this situation. But after the COVID-19, the Russian-Ukrainian war started. The devastating effects of the war and the pandemic had an impact on almost every country in the world. In a crisis, governmental policies and measures restrict people's earnings and spending. In this situation, the flow of foreign remittances was also hampered in Sri Lanka and other low-income economies. The Sri Lankan economy was already struggling because of the COVID-19 pandemic, export reduction, tourism hamper, etc. But the negative impacts of the war immensely raised the global price of crude oil and refined petroleum products. Now the problem was, these two are the largest import goods of Sri Lanka, and by the initial stage of 2022, the country had to face its largest downgrade of foreign reserves, and it took a major part in the collapse of the Lankan economy. Finally, when the global economic crisis hit the shores of Sri Lanka, the country went bankrupt. As the country faced a shortage of foreign reserves, the country couldn't even import necessary goods and food in this situation. The previous suppliers who increased the credits supplied to Sri Lanka were also backing up due to the devastating condition of the economy. In such a critical situation, worst of all, Sri Lanka was hit by a food crisis in the year 2022. Some economists believe that the lack of proper leadership and stubbornness of the government in seeking help from the IMF is one of the major reasons why Sri Lanka collapsed so drastically during the global economic crisis. This situation also led to the collapse of political stability, and the government of the country was down. The role played by China. Now the main question is, who is responsible for all these? Is China the responsible party for the destruction of the economy, or Sri Lanka itself is the main player who led to the devastating situation of its economy? No question about the fact that China is currently the biggest outstanding debtor of Sri Lanka, holding 10% of its foreign debts. If we analyze it deeply, it can be seen that almost all the projects funded by China in Sri Lanka can be called useless for the economic benefits of Sri Lanka. While everyone blames China to be the manipulator of the projects that are taken in the host countries, China supports itself by claiming that it is the host countries who select the projects that are implemented in their country. And some economists claim that it is true in the case of Sri Lanka. After the post-2005 era, many Chinese-funded projects in Sri Lanka were taken even if they were not economically beneficial. Though, as an individual party, China is the biggest debtor of Sri Lanka. International sovereign bonds (ISB) are another major factor that caused Sri Lanka to go bankrupt. Currently, the level of international sovereign bonds outstanding for Sri Lanka is more than $10 billion, while the loans from IMF, World Bank, and ADB interest rates are around 0.25 to 3% a year. The interest rates of ISB bonds are 5.75% to 8% a year. So, China is not at all the main party that caused the economic crisis in Sri Lanka. It was the government of Sri Lanka and its corruption that led to the destruction of the economy. Though China was a major player in doing so, they cannot be blamed much for this. Every country needs to protect itself and make itself powerful to survive in global geopolitics. Now comes the big lesson from today's case study. If a nation cannot protect itself from corruption and political unrest, it will not be able to protect itself from outside invaders. Sooner or later, their economy and land will be hampered by outside parties who will think only for their interest. And in global geopolitics, no one has a friend, only the tactical ones survive.